A few days after D-Day, Adolf Hitler made one of the most important decisions of the Second World War. He decided to wait, not because his generals told him to, not because his armies weren't ready, because of a message. The message claimed that the invasion of Normandy wasn't the real attack. The real invasion was still coming, further north, at Calais. Hitler believed it. So did much of the German High Command. As Allied soldiers fought their way inland, thousands of German troops remained where they were, waiting for an army that didn't exist. The man responsible wasn't a famous general. He wasn't a politician. He wasn't even a trained spy. A few years earlier, British intelligence had looked at him and decided he was completely useless. But now, one of the most powerful men on earth trusted him enough to gamble the future of a war. His name was Juan Pujol García. And the strangest part of this story isn't that he fooled Hitler. It's how close he came to never becoming a spy at all. June 9th, 1944. 3 days after Allied troops landed on the beaches of Normandy, a message arrived in Berlin. At first, it didn't seem remarkable. Germany was receiving thousands of reports every week. Military updates, intercepted communications, intelligence summaries, rumors, predictions. War creates information faster than anyone can process it. But this message was different because of who sent it. For years, the source behind the report had quietly built a reputation inside German intelligence. His information was detailed, consistent, reliable. When other agents exaggerated, he didn't. When other reports contradicted each other, his somehow fit together. Again and again, he had proven himself. So when his latest message reached senior German commanders, they paid attention. The report argued that Normandy was not the main invasion. The landings that had shocked the world just days earlier were only the beginning. The real attack, it claimed, was still coming. Further north, Pas de Calais, the shortest crossing between Britain and France, exactly where German planners had expected the Allies to strike all along. The report moved up the chain of command, across desks, across offices, eventually reaching Adolf Hitler himself, and Hitler believed it. Over the following days, German divisions remained in place. Armored units that could have reinforced Normandy waited for an attack that never arrived. Thousands of soldiers sat ready, watching, preparing, waiting for an army that did not exist. Historians still debate many things about D-Day, but on one point, there is little disagreement. The success of the invasion depended on convincing Germany that Normandy was not the real target, and somehow, someone managed to do exactly that. The question is, who was the man capable of convincing Hitler to ignore the largest invasion in history? The answer wasn't a general, or a politician, or even a professional spy. In fact, just a few years earlier, nobody wanted him at all. If you were building a spy from scratch, Juan Pujol García is probably not who you would choose. Before the war, his life seemed to move in circles. He tried business, that didn't work. He tried managing a cinema, that didn't work either. At one point, he became a chicken farmer. For a while, it looked promising. Then disease swept through the farm. Thousands of chickens died. The business collapsed. It became a pattern. Plans failed. Jobs disappeared. Money came and went. Nothing seemed to last. There are people who look back on their lives and can point to a moment when everything began to make sense. For Pujol, this wasn't that kind of story. By the late 1930s, he was still searching for direction. And then Spain fell apart. The Spanish Civil War tore through the country with a kind of brutality that left little room for neutrality. Families were divided. Neighbors disappeared. Political loyalties became matters of life and death. Pujol found himself trapped in the middle of it. Years later, he would describe his hatred for both sides of the conflict. Not because he didn't care what happened, because he cared too much. He watched ordinary people become consumed by ideology. He watched violence become routine. He watched movements that promised a better future justify almost anything in its name. The experience stayed with him. Long after the war ended, long after the gunfire stopped, and when another conflict began spreading across Europe, Pujol recognized something familiar. The flags were different, the uniforms were different, but the certainty was the same. The belief that history belonged to the strongest. The belief that individuals were expendable. The belief that power made people important. Juan Pujol wasn't important, at least not yet. He was a failed businessman, a failed farmer, a man with no military training, no intelligence experience, no influence. But as Europe moved closer to another war, he became convinced of one thing: Hitler had to be stopped. In 1941, Juan Pujol decided he wanted to fight the Nazis, not with a rifle, not on a battlefield, as a spy. It was an ambitious plan for a man with absolutely no experience, no military background, no intelligence training, no connections, just conviction. So he did the obvious thing. He went to the British. Pujol walked into the British embassy in Madrid and offered his services. The answer was no. Not a hostile no, not even a memorable one. Just the kind of rejection that bureaucracies deliver every day. Polite, quick, forgettable. The British had no reason to trust him. From their perspective, he was just another stranger claiming he could help win a war. So Pujol tried again, and failed again, then again. Nothing changed. No meetings, no recruitment, no secret assignment. Every door stayed closed. The more he pushed, the more ridiculous the situation became, because Pujol genuinely believed he could help, and nobody else seemed to agree. Most people would have accepted reality at that point. The British weren't interested. The conversation was over. Pujol saw it differently. If Britain refused to make him a spy, maybe somebody else would. It's the kind of idea that sounds clever for about 5 seconds, then completely insane. Because the somebody else he had in mind wasn't another Allied country. It was Nazi Germany. Pujol's new plan was simple. He would convince the Germans that he supported their cause, become one of their agents, earn their trust, and then use that position to help the Allies from the inside. There were obvious problems with this strategy. For one thing, if the Germans discovered what he was doing, they would almost certainly kill him. For another, there was no guarantee the British would ever work with him. He could end up trapped between two intelligence services, trusted by neither. But by this point, rejection had stopped discouraging him. If anything, it had made him more determined. And so, after being turned away by the people he wanted to help, Juan Pujol went looking for the enemy instead. The meeting took place in Madrid. No secret bunker, no dramatic chase. Just a conversation between a German intelligence officer and a man who desperately wanted to be taken seriously. The officer's name was Federico. His job was simple: find people willing to work for Germany. And sitting across from him was Juan Pujol García, a failed businessman, a failed farmer, a man with no intelligence background whatsoever. On paper, he was exactly the kind of person German intelligence should have ignored. Instead, Federico listened, and Pujol performed. He spoke about politics, about the war, about his admiration for Germany, about his belief that Britain was in decline. Everything Federico wanted to hear. It was an act, a carefully constructed character. But the strange thing about Pujol was that he had been preparing for this moment his entire life without realizing it. As a child, he escaped into stories. As an adult, he learned how to survive uncertainty by becoming whatever a situation required. Now, for the first time, those instincts had a purpose. Federico was convinced the Germans had found a loyal supporter, someone who could travel to Britain and build an intelligence network from the inside. Pujol was officially recruited. The Germans handed him training materials, codes, instructions, money, everything a new spy would need. Then they gave him his assignment: travel to Britain, observe everything, report back. From Germany's perspective, the operation had gone perfectly. They had gained a new asset, a man positioned inside enemy territory, a man who would spend the coming years sending some of the most valuable intelligence of the war. At least that's what they believed. Because while the Germans thought they had recruited a spy, Pujol was already planning something else. He wasn't interested in helping Germany win the war. He never had been. The entire recruitment had been a means to an end, a way to get inside the system, a way to earn trust, a way to build something much bigger. The Germans thought they had just recruited an agent. In reality, they had just recruited their most dangerous enemy. There was only one problem. His first mission required him to move to Britain, and Juan Pujol had absolutely no intention of going there. The Germans believed Juan Pujol was heading to Britain. He wasn't. Instead, he went to Portugal. And for a while, nobody noticed. This should have been the point where the entire operation collapsed. A spy who never reaches his assignment is not much use to anyone. But Pujol had a different idea. If he couldn't spy on Britain, he would invent it. From a distance, Britain became a collection of clues. Newspapers, travel guides, maps borrowed from libraries, magazine articles, shipping schedules, small details that most people would ignore. Pujol studied them obsessively. Then he started writing. His reports described places he had never seen, conversations he had never heard, military activity he had never witnessed. At first, the lies were relatively small. A ship spotted here, a military convoy spotted there. The kind of information that sounded important, but was difficult to verify. The Germans were satisfied, so Pujol became bolder. Soon, one man wasn't enough to explain how he was gathering information from all across Britain. He needed help, or at least the illusion of it. So he created his first agent, a loyal source with access to information Pujol supposedly couldn't reach himself. The Germans accepted him without question. A few weeks later, another appeared, then another, each with a name, a job, a personality, a reason for being exactly where they needed to be. One lived near a port, another traveled frequently, a third had connections that allowed him to hear useful rumors. The reports became more detailed, more convincing, more alive, because Pujol understood something important. Real people are messy, they get sick, miss trains, forget things, make mistakes, so his agents did too. One needed money, another got into trouble, a third became unreliable. The flaws made them believable, and the Germans loved them. They weren't just reading intelligence reports anymore. They were managing an entire network, paying salaries, funding operations, sending money to support agents scattered across Britain. Agents they believed were risking their lives for Germany. There was only one problem. None of them existed. Not the businessman, not the traveler, not the courier, not the source at the docks, not any of them. The network wasn't hidden. It wasn't underground. It wasn't waiting to be discovered. It existed entirely inside the mind of one man sitting hundreds of miles away in Portugal. And somehow, the Germans trusted it completely. In fact, by this point, they trusted it so much that another intelligence service was beginning to notice, because somewhere in Britain, officials were reading reports about a remarkably successful German spy network operating across the country. And they had absolutely no idea where it was. At first, British intelligence didn't know who Juan Pujol was. What they knew was that somewhere inside Britain, the Germans appeared to have an unusually effective spy network. The reports kept arriving in Berlin. Detailed reports, specific reports, reports describing military activity, troop movements, and life inside Britain with surprising confidence. If the Germans really had agents operating across the country, that was a serious problem. So MI5 started looking. And the deeper they looked, the stranger things became. The network seemed to be everywhere. One source was near a port. Another was gathering information from a different region. Others appeared scattered across the country. Yet nobody could find them. No surveillance, no arrests, no intercepted meetings, nothing. It was as if the network existed everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Then somebody noticed something odd. Some of the reports contained small mistakes, not major mistakes. The kind only a foreigner would make. References that sounded British, but not quite. Details that felt researched rather than experienced. The closer they examined the reports, the more unusual they became, because whoever was writing them clearly wasn't working for Germany. Many of the reports were misleading, technically plausible, but strategically useless, sometimes worse than useless. The information was quietly pushing German intelligence in the wrong direction, which raised an entirely different question. If this wasn't a German spy network, who was behind it? Eventually, MI5 found their answer, and the answer was almost absurd. The vast network they had been searching for wasn't a network at all. It was one man, Juan Pujol García, a Spaniard, working largely from imagination. No team, no organization, no secret army of agents. Just one person writing reports, convincing enough to fool an intelligence service. Most governments would have arrested him. MI5 did something else. They hired him. Because if one man could create an imaginary network that Germany already trusted, imagine what he could do with Britain's help. And from that moment on, Juan Pujol stopped pretending to be a spy. He became one. By 1944, the Allies were preparing for something unprecedented, an invasion across the English Channel. Hundreds of thousands of men, thousands of ships, thousands of vehicles, the largest amphibious operation in military history. The problem was that you can't hide something that large. Sooner or later, Germany would know an invasion was coming. The real challenge was convincing them it would happen somewhere else. The operation was called Fortitude, and at its core was a simple idea. If Germany expected the invasion at Pas de Calais, then the Allies would give them exactly what they expected to see. A phantom army began to appear across southeastern England. From the air, it looked convincing. Military camps, vehicle depots, supply dumps, entire formations preparing for war. But much of it wasn't real. The tanks were inflatable. The equipment was fake. Wooden aircraft sat on airfields. Dummy landing craft lined the coast. Radio operators filled the airwaves with messages from units that didn't exist. Even the famous American General George Patton was assigned a role in the deception because German intelligence believed he would lead the main invasion force. Every piece of the operation had the same purpose: to tell a story in which Normandy was a distraction, and Calais was the real target. But there was a problem. No matter how convincing the fake tanks looked, no matter how many false radio messages were transmitted, none of it mattered if Germany didn't believe it. Deception requires trust. And by 1944, Germany trusted one man more than almost anyone else: Garbo. For years, he had been quietly building credibility inside the German intelligence system. Every carefully crafted report, every invented agent, every small success, every believable mistake, it had all been leading here. Now Garbo became the voice, carrying the deception directly into Berlin. He didn't simply tell the Germans what to think. He gave them evidence supporting what they already wanted to believe: that the shortest route across the Channel was still the most logical target, that Normandy was too obvious, too risky, too secondary. Report by report, the illusion grew stronger, and the more Germany invested in the story, the harder it became to question it. Soon, one of the largest military decisions of the war would depend on whether they continued believing him. A failed chicken farmer from Spain had somehow become one of the most trusted sources inside Nazi Germany, and the most important message of his life was still ahead. And so we return to June 1944. The beaches of Normandy were already crowded with soldiers. The invasion had begun, but beginning an invasion and surviving one are very different things. The Allies had secured a foothold in France, but the situation remained fragile. Germany still possessed powerful armored divisions. If enough of them reached Normandy quickly, the landings could become a disaster. This was the moment everything had been building toward. Years of deception, years of fabricated reports, years spent earning trust. Now Garbo had to convince Germany of one final lie. On June 9th, a message was sent, not claiming that Normandy was unimportant. That would have been too obvious, too suspicious. Instead, the report told a more believable story. Normandy was real, but it wasn't the main attack. The true invasion, Garbo insisted, was still coming. Pas de Calais remained the objective. The forces in Normandy were merely the opening move. The Germans received the report. Then they did something that would shape the course of the war. They believed it. Hitler believed it. Senior commanders believed it. And because they believed it, large formations remained where they were, waiting, watching, preparing for a second invasion that never arrived. Day after day, the expected attack failed to appear. But by then, precious time had already been lost. Time for Allied reinforcements to arrive. Time for supplies to cross the Channel. Time for the beachhead to become something more permanent. The story Garbo had spent years constructing was finally paying off. Not because it was perfect, but because it had become familiar. Germany trusted the messenger. And when people trust the messenger, they often stop questioning the message. By the time the truth became impossible to ignore, Normandy had survived. The invasion that was supposed to fail had taken hold, and one of the most successful deception operations in military history was complete. The strange thing is that the lie itself wasn't particularly complicated. The difficult part had been convincing an entire intelligence system to believe it, and Juan Pujol had spent years doing exactly that. When the war ended, Juan Pujol found himself in a strange position. He had spent years deceiving one of the most dangerous governments on earth. The Germans believed he had been one of their most loyal agents. The British knew he had helped deceive Germany at a critical moment, and now the war was over. But intelligence work has a habit of creating enemies that outlive conflicts. Pujol worried that surviving Nazis might eventually discover the truth. If they did, revenge was not impossible, so a plan was created. Juan Pujol García would disappear. In the years after the war, reports began to circulate that he had died. According to the story, he had succumbed to malaria in Angola. For most people, that was the end of it. The famous spy was gone. His story became history, then memory, then something closer to myth. But the story wasn't true. Pujol was alive, very much alive, living quietly in Venezuela, running businesses, raising a family, watching the world move on without him. For decades, one of the most successful double agents in history lived in near anonymity. The man who had once influenced military decisions made by Hitler now spent his days as an ordinary citizen, and for a long time, almost nobody knew where he was. Then, in 1984, something remarkable happened. After decades in the shadows, Pujol returned to Britain. Many of the people who had worked with him during the war were now elderly. Some hadn't seen him in 40 years. Others believed he was dead, because as far as they knew, he was. When Pujol entered one gathering of former intelligence officers, the room reportedly fell silent. One man stared at him for a moment, trying to process what he was seeing. Then he said the only thing that made sense, "You're dead." It's a funny line. But it was also the perfect ending for Juan Pujol García, a man who spent his life convincing people to believe things that weren't true, and somehow even his own death became one of them. For most of his life, Juan Pujol García was the kind of person history usually ignores. He wasn't a general, he wasn't a politician, he wasn't a celebrated war hero. He was a failed businessman, a failed farmer, a man repeatedly told, in one way or another, that he wasn't particularly important. And for a long time, that seemed true. But history has a strange relationship with importance. Sometimes it isn't the people with the most power who shape events. Sometimes it's the people nobody notices. The people standing just outside the spotlight. The people underestimated by everyone around them. Years before D-Day, Britain looked at Juan Pujol and saw nothing useful. Years later, Adolf Hitler trusted him more than he trusted reality itself. More than photographs, more than battlefield reports, more than what was happening right in front of him. And that trust changed the course of a war, not because Pujol was stronger than an army or smarter than an entire government, but because he understood something simple. People rarely believe what is true. They believe what makes sense to them,